Today on Dub World, we're talking about an uncomfortable subject, and that's engine fires. So I just wanted to go over a few things with you really quick, especially if you're new to Volkswagens. Now, you've probably seen a lot of talk about fires with these old cars, and it does happen, it can happen. You see it a lot with the Volkswagen buses, and let me tell you why it happens. There's a lot of things that can possibly go wrong, but when you're driving an older vehicle, preventative maintenance is key here. The very first thing that you should be looking out for are fuel hoses. This is something that's a really cheap fix, costs you about $10 for a meter of fuel hose, and it's something you should definitely replace, especially if you don't know how old the fuel hoses are on your car. If you look here, these are the original style cloth braided fuel lines, or fuel hoses I should say. This is what Volkswagen used from the factory. They're a rubber hose with an exterior cloth binding. That cloth binding actually helps the hose stay tightly on the fuel pump and the carburetor and the lines. So you can see here I have clamps on the fuel pump. These hoses fit so tightly that they're difficult to pull off even without clamps. But if you want to be extra safe, definitely run the clamps on your parts so you can avoid any leaks. Just on a side note here, because we're looking at a Beetle engine, later model buses, especially fuel injected cars, of course that can be type 3, can be type 4 buses, you really want to make sure that you change the fuel hoses in those, because it's high pressure with fuel injection, and when those hoses fail, it's almost certainly a fire. So make sure you get all those replaced. Any seals for your fuel injectors, all that should be replaced. Now these hoses, I generally replace these once a year just to make sure. We do have ethanol gas, which eats rubber. If you can find non-ethanol gas in your area, definitely go with that, because that's going to keep your fuel lines, everything will be in better shape. Now, as far as a fire in a Beetle or a Ghia, typically if it's not a failed fuel hose, you usually have an issue with either a fuel filter, and there's a lot of debate with people having fuel filters right about here. They're generally plastic and they don't have any barbed ends, which means they're just smooth and that hose simply slides on. Well, that plastic can get soft, it can get heated up, and the hose can pop right out of the filter and spray gas all over your engine, and especially on your distributor here, which is sparking and cause a nice fire. That's why I don't recommend any fuel filters in the engine compartment. In my opinion, the best place to keep a fuel filter is right as the fuel hose exits out of the tunnel in the car, right by the transmission. That way you'll catch any debris from your line that runs from the tunnel to the back, also anything from your fuel tank. That's the best spot in my opinion to put it. That's where I put it on my cars, although sometimes I'll put it right under the fuel tank as well. The other issue that these cars have is the carburetor. The original carburetors, which this is not, have a pressed-in fitting up there in the top where the fuel hose goes. And over the years, as you pull the hose off and put new hose on back and forth, that can wear out that fitting, and one day you'll be driving along and all of a sudden, boom, this just pops right out, and then you've got your pump spraying gas all over. That is a pretty common thing that happens with the fires, either that fuel filter or that pesky inlet there for the top of your carburetor. So if you buy a new carburetor, a lot of them come with a threaded barbed fitting on the top of the carburetor, so they will not be able to pop out anymore. I would recommend that. You can also do that with your original carburetor too, if you don't mind changing it. This carburetor I'm using here is an empty one, and it does have the screw-in type fitting on the top. The other thing I've seen is the fuel pump failing as well. There are various types of fuel pumps out there. This one here is a completely sealed pump. You can't take it apart. The fittings for the inlet and the outlet are welded to the pump itself, so they cannot come out. But I have seen, and I personally experienced, one of the fittings actually the one that pumps to the carburetor, popping out and spraying gas all over my car. I was driving, I smelled strong gas and immediately turned the car off, ran to the back, went to open the deck lid. This was in a Carmen Ghia, and I saw fuel streaming out of the Volkswagen emblem. I had my fire extinguisher in hand. I opened it up, and very fortunate, there was no fire. There was gas everywhere, but no fire. So the fuel pump itself was brand new and it failed. And the shop I was working at, we decided we would never sell any of those fuel pumps again with those pressed in fittings. So that's something to look out for as well. If you've got a pump that has pressed in fittings, a lot of the original Volkswagen fuel pumps are like that. Aftermarket ones mostly do not have that style. So that's really the main things that you got to look out for. Your fuel hoses, your carburetor, that fuel filter position, making sure all that is squared away. One other thing that I want to touch on here is Volkswagen goes from a cloth line to a metal line. As you can see here, I don't have a clamp there. That is very low pressure and that hose is on very tightly. If you feel more comfortable running a clamp, put a clamp on it. You see I have them here, and really I don't need them, but they're there. But this line goes to the back and it goes right through that engine tin. And if you look here, you'll see a fuel hose. I'm sorry, it's a little dark. But that fuel hose is actually not the fuel hose that's coming into the car. That is there because the original grommet on that engine tin is missing. So in order to keep that metal line from rubbing on that tin and possibly cutting into it, I've put that piece of hose there to protect it. One day I'll get the original grommet in there and then we can just let that line go through it like original. So it's another place you want to check and make sure that you've got a grommet there, and if you don't have a grommet, put a piece of hose or something to keep it from rubbing so that you don't end up with a leak. So that's it. That's my tip here. The only other thing I'll say is make sure you keep a fire extinguisher. You can get one pretty inexpensively at most stores. Just make sure it's rated for automotive use. The other thing you can do is add a blaze cut style system which goes up in your deck lid. This is a tube filled with a fire suppressant. When it senses too much heat, aka a fire, it will burst and it will put out the flame. These have become very popular lately, and I see a lot of people installing them in their cars. There is one other aspect that I want to touch upon here. It's a lot less common, but it is a potential problem. If you look at the carburetor, and you look towards the base there, you can see some discoloration. And the discoloration would indicate some type of a fuel leak. And what can happen is the carburetor gets old, it gets worn out, and the throttle shaft bushings inside that carburetor get worn out, and it can start leaking fuel. Now it can leak fuel while it's running, but usually what will happen is if you turn the vehicle off and you have an issue with the carburetor, and this is a whole other topic, but you can have fuel leaking inside the carburetor with the engine off, and it can leak out of that throttle linkage, the shaft there, and leak down on your engine and can cause an engine fire. So that's something else you want to check out. If your vehicle's running, check, feel around that area, make sure nothing's leaking, turn it off, come and check as well. And again, if it is leaking there, it can be a lot of different causes. It can be a bad float, it can be a bad needle and seat, you can have too much fuel pressure, but again, that's a topic for another day. But that's the last of the potential fuel issues. The only other thing that I would add is make sure all of your wires are good, your coil is good. You want everything operating correctly. If the wires are in good shape, your cap, everything's going to be sparking correctly. You're not going to have random sparks moving around your engine compartment. And especially if you've got any bad wires up in here, you could even have a crack in your cap. You could have random sparks coming out, which obviously could ignite fuel. So you want to make sure everything's in tip-top shape. All your electrical connections are good. You want to make sure everything connected to your coil, anything that you have connected just to the carburetor for the choke, everything is in good shape. Again, we started out talking about preventative maintenance, and that is key here to making sure your vehicle runs fine and that you avoid any potential fires. Well, I hope this video has been informative and will get you to a place where you can feel confident and safe in driving your Volkswagen. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. I appreciate the comments. Like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Also, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any videos. I try to get something posted every week. It doesn't always happen, but most of the time it does. But the more that you watch and the more you comment, the more the channel can grow and we can get the word out there to other VW fans. Thank you again for your time, and I will see you soon.